Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. Shame is not emotion but is technology, is the mechanism through which groups control individuals, through which societies enforce norms, through which collectives ensure conformity without the need for constant surveillance, constant punishment, constant external force, because the force becomes internal, becomes the voice inside that judges, that condemns, that produces the feeling of being fundamentally wrong, fundamentally defective, fundamentally unworthy. And this feeling is more powerful than any external punishment, is more effective than any threat, is the weapon that societies have perfected over millennia, the conversion of social judgment into self-judgment, the transformation of external control into internal monitoring. And the monitoring is constant, is automatic, is happening at every moment, in every decision, in every thought that might deviate from what is acceptable, what is expected, what is required. And the requirement is not explicit, is not written down, is absorbed through observation, through imitation, through the thousand small corrections that shape children into members of the group. And the shaping is violent, is coercive, is the moulding of consciousness to fit the pattern that the society demands. And the demands vary by culture, by context, by what behaviours serve the group's interests. But the mechanism is universal, is present in every society, is the way that humans have solved the problem of coordination, the problem of getting individuals to behave in ways that benefit the collective, even when those behaviours conflict with individual interest, and the conflict is constant. Is the tension between what the self wants and what the group requires? And shame is what tips the balance, is what makes the group's requirements feel like the self's requirements, is what converts external judgment into internal compulsion. And the compulsion is not experienced as coercion, but as conscience, as the sense of right and wrong that seems to come from within, but is really coming from the group, from the internalized voices of parents, of peers, of authorities, of all the representatives of social norms who have spoken, and whose speaking has been absorbed, has been converted into the inner voice that judges, that shames, that produces the feeling that is unbearable, that is worse than pain. That is the sense of being exposed, of being seen in one's wrongness, in one's defectiveness, in one's failure to meet the standards that everyone else seems to meet effortlessly. And the effortlessness is illusion, is the result of successful internalization, is what happens when shame has done its work, when the external has become internal, when the monitoring is so automatic that it feels like nature, like the way things are, like the voice of truth rather than the voice of power. And power is what shame is the exercise of control, is the way that the group extends its reach into the individual, into the mind, into the private space where decisions are made. And the decisions are not free, are not autonomous, are shaped by the anticipation of shame, by the fear of exposure, by the need to maintain the facade of being acceptable, of being worthy, of being someone who meets the standards. And the standards are impossible, are designed to be impossible, are set high enough that everyone fails, that everyone is vulnerable to shame, that everyone needs the group's forgiveness, the group's acceptance, the group's willingness to overlook the failures, as long as the proper contrition is shown, the proper submission is performed, the proper deference is given to the norms that were violated, and the violation is inevitable, is guaranteed, is the way that shame maintains its power. Because if everyone could meet the standards, then shame would lose its force, would become irrelevant, would no longer be useful for control. And so the standards are calibrated, are adjusted, are maintained at the level where most people are failing most of the time, are feeling inadequate, are needing reassurance, are seeking validation. And the seeking is the mechanism, is the way that shame produces conformity, produces obedience, produces the constant effort to be good, to be acceptable, to be worthy of belonging. And belonging is what is at stake, is what shame threatens, is the thing that will be lost if the shame is too great, if the exposure is too complete, if the judgment is too severe. And the severity is variable, is depending on culture, on context, on what the group needs to enforce. And what it needs to enforce varies, is different in honor cultures, where shame is about reputation, about the family's standing, about the public face that must be maintained, and in guilt cultures, where shame is about internal states, about intentions, about the purity of the conscience. And the conscience is the internalized judge, is the voice that speaks even when no one is watching, that produces guilt even in private, that makes the internal monitoring as effective as external surveillance. And the effectiveness is what makes guilt cultures powerful, is what allows them to function with less overt control, with less public punishment. Because the punishment is internal, is the guilt that gnaws, that torments, that produces the feeling of being wrong, even when the behavior is hidden, even when the transgression is secret. And the secret is what guilt cultures target, is what they make unbearable, is what they convert into shame through the internalization of norms, through the creation of conscience, through the training of the inner voice to judge, to condemn, to produce the feeling that is worse than any external punishment. And the worse is the genius of the system, is the efficiency of shame, is the way that control becomes self-control, that power becomes invisible, that coercion becomes choice, and the choice is not free but is shaped by the anticipation of shame, by the fear of guilt, by the need to avoid the feeling that is unbearable. And the unbearable is what shame produces, is the emotion that is more painful than physical pain, that is more threatening than external danger, that is triggering the same neural circuits as social death, as exile, as the exclusion that in ancestral environments meant literal death, meant the end of survival. And so the fear of shame is ancient, is hardwired, is operating at levels deeper than reason, deeper than conscious thought, is producing reactions that are automatic, that are visceral, that are overwhelming. And the overwhelming is what makes shame effective, is what makes it useful for control, is what makes it the primary mechanism through which societies enforce norms, maintain order, ensure that individuals behave in ways that serve the collective. And the serving is not voluntary, is not chosen, is coerced through shame, through the threat of exposure, through the fear of judgment. And the judgment is constant, is omnipresent, is coming from others and from the self, from the internalized voices that have become the conscience, the superego, the inner critic that never rests, never forgives, never allows the self to feel acceptable, to feel worthy, to feel free from the threat of shame. And the threat is maintained through public shaming, through the rituals that expose transgressions, that make violations visible, that demonstrate what happens to those who break the rules. And the demonstration is warning, is deterrent, is the reminder that shame is always possible, is always lurking, is always ready to destroy the reputation, the standing, the sense of belonging that makes life bearable. And the bearable is what shame threatens, is what it takes away, is what it uses as leverage to control, to coerce, to enforce the norms that maintain the group, that preserve the hierarchy, that ensure that power is distributed according to the rules. And the rules are not natural, are not discovered, are imposed, are created by those who benefit from them, by those who have power, by those who use shame to maintain their position, to prevent challenge, to ensure that those below stay below, that those who are shamed remain shamed, that the hierarchy is preserved, and the preservation is what shame serves, is what it accomplishes, is the maintenance of order through the creation of internal monitoring, through the transformation of social control into self-control. And the self-control is not freedom, but is the most perfect form of slavery, is the condition where the chains are invisible, where the prison is internal, where the guard is the self, and the self cannot escape, cannot rebel, cannot refuse, because the refusal would produce shame, would trigger the feeling that is unbearable, would expose the self to judgment, and the judgment is what is feared most, is what drives behaviour, is what makes people do things they do not want to do, believe things they do not believe, perform roles they do not choose, because the alternative is shame, is exposure, is the loss of belonging, and belonging is survival, is the thing that makes life possible, that makes existence tolerable, that provides meaning and purpose and the sense that one matters. And mattering is what shame threatens, is what it takes away, is what it holds hostage. And the hostage is the self, is the identity that is constructed through the internalization of norms, through the absorption of judgments, through the acceptance of the standards that the group imposes, and the imposing is not negotiable, is not optional, is the price of membership, the cost of belonging, the requirement for survival, and survival requires shame, requires the capacity to feel it, to be shaped by it, to use it to regulate behaviour, to monitor thought, to police the boundaries of the acceptable. And the acceptable is narrow, is constrained, is defined by the group, and the group's definition is arbitrary, is variable, is serving interests that are not the individual's interests, that are the interests of power, of hierarchy, of the maintenance of the order that benefits some at the expense of others. And the others are kept in place through shame, through the feeling that they are less, that they are wrong, that they are unworthy, and the unworthiness is not fact but is assignment, is the judgment that the group makes, that the individual internalizes, that becomes the truth of the self, the core belief around which identity is organized, and the organization is pathological, is producing suffering, is creating the sense that the self is fundamentally defective, fundamentally wrong, fundamentally deserving of the judgment, and the judgment is harsh, is relentless, is coming from within and without, from the self and from others, and the others are always watching, always judging, always ready to shame. And the readiness is maintained through public shaming, through the revival of practices that were thought to be barbaric, to be outdated, to be incompatible with modern values, but are returning, are being embraced, are being used with new technologies, with social media, with the platforms that make public shaming instantaneous, global, permanent. And the permanence is new, is the addition that technology brings, is the way that shame now lasts forever, is recorded, is searchable, is never forgotten. And the never forgotten is the enhancement of shame, is the intensification of its power, is the conversion of temporary judgment into permanent stigma. And the stigma is the mark, is the label, is the thing that defines the person, that reduces them to their failure, to their transgression, to the moment when they were exposed, when they were judged, when they were shamed. And the shaming is not correction, is not education, is not intended to help, but is intended to punish, to exclude, to destroy. And the destruction is what public shaming achieves, is what it is designed to do, is the elimination of the person from the community, from the acceptable, from the realm of those who matter. And the mattering is what is taken away, is what shame removes, is what is lost when the judgment is public, when the exposure is complete, when the person becomes the embodiment of wrongness, of defectiveness, of unworthiness, and the unworthiness is total, is overwhelming, is the condition that produces not just embarrassment, but the deeper shame, the toxic shame. The shame that is not about what one did, but about what one is, and the is the problem, is the conversion of behavior into identity, is the judgment that extends from the action to the actor, from the mistake to the person, from the moment to the essence. And the essence is what shame targets, is what it damages, is what it destroys, is the sense of being fundamentally acceptable, fundamentally worthy, fundamentally deserving of existence. And the existence becomes questionable, becomes something that must be justified, must be earned, must be proven through the constant performance of acceptability, and the performance is exhausting, is impossible, is the burden that shame creates, is the weight that is carried by everyone who has internalized the judgment, who has absorbed the norms, who has become the monitor of their own behavior. And the monitoring is constant, is automatic, is producing anxiety, is producing the sense that at any moment the failure might happen, the exposure might occur, the shame might descend, and the descending is what is feared, is what drives the performance, is what makes people desperate to be good, to be acceptable, to be beyond reproach. And the beyond reproach is impossible, is unattainable, is the standard that ensures everyone is vulnerable, everyone is exposed, everyone is subject to shame. And the subject is the self, is the identity that is constructed through shame, that is defined by the internalized judgments, that is shaped by the fear of exposure. And the exposure is what social media enables, is what the digital age amplifies, is the possibility that at any moment anything might be revealed, anything might be judged, anything might become the basis for public shaming. And the basis is often trivial, is often a mistake, is often something that in another context would be ignored, would be forgotten, would be forgiven, but in the context of public shaming becomes unforgivable, becomes the thing that defines, that destroys, that reduces the person to the object of judgment, to the target of collective rage, to the scapegoat that the group needs, that the society uses, that shame requires. Because shame is not just individual, but is collective, is not just personal, but is social, is not just feeling, but is function, is the mechanism through which groups maintain cohesion, through which societies enforce norms, through which power maintains itself, and the maintenance is achieved through the constant threat of shame, through the ever-present possibility of exposure, through the fear that keeps people in line, keeps them conforming, keeps them performing the roles that the society assigns. And the assignment is not chosen, is not negotiated, is imposed through shame, through the feeling that to deviate is to be wrong, to be defective, to be unworthy. And the unworthiness is the lever, is the tool, is the way that power operates, is the currency that shame represents, is the thing that is spent, that is accumulated, that is traded in the social economy, where reputation is wealth, where honor is capital, where shame is debt, and the debt is inherited, is passed down, is the legacy of transgression, is what families carry, what lineages bear, what communities cannot escape. Because shame is not just about the individual, but is about the group, is about the collective honor that must be maintained, that must be protected, that must be defended against the contamination of shame. And the contamination is what happens when one member transgresses, when one person is exposed, when one individual brings shame upon the family, upon the community, upon the collective. And the collective responds with punishment, with exclusion, with the violence that is justified by the need to restore honor, to remove the stain, to eliminate the source of shame. And the elimination can be social, can be physical, can be the death that honor cultures prescribe, that honor killings enforce, that the logic of shame demands when the transgression is too great, when the exposure is too complete, when the only way to restore honor is to destroy the source of dishonor, and the destruction is murder, is violence, is the extreme form of shame's power, is what happens when shame is not just emotion, but is law, is not just feeling, but is justice, is not just internal, but is external, is enforced not just by conscience, but by the community. And the community is the enforcer, is the judge, is the executioner, is the thing that makes shame lethal, that makes shame literal death. And the death is what shame has always threatened, is what it has always implied, is what it is metaphorically, and sometimes literally, producing, is the end of social existence, the end of belonging, the end of the self as recognized, as valued, as mattering. And the mattering is what makes life worth living, is what makes existence bearable, is what shame takes away, is what shame holds hostage, is what shame uses to control, to coerce, to enforce the norms that maintain the group, that preserve the hierarchy, that ensure that power remains distributed according to the rules. And the rules are maintained through shame, are enforced through guilt, are perpetuated through the internalization of judgment, through the conversion of external control into internal monitoring, through the creation of the conscience that is not freedom, but is the most sophisticated form of slavery, is the condition where the individual has become the agent of their own oppression, has become the enforcer of the norms that harm them, has become the voice that judges, that shames, that makes life unbearable. And the unbearable is what shame produces, is what it is designed to produce, is the mechanism through which societies control individuals, through which power maintains itself, through which the currency of shame is spent, is accumulated, is traded, is the thing that makes social life possible, that makes coordination achievable, that makes conformity enforceable, and the enforcement is continuous, is total, is the permanent condition of social existence, is the cost of belonging, is the price of survival, is the burden that everyone carries, is the weight of shame, of guilt, of the internalized judgment that never rests, never forgives, never allows the self to be free, to be acceptable, to be beyond the reach of shame. And the reach is infinite, is extending into every moment, every decision, every thought, is the omnipresent threat that keeps people in line, that makes them perform, that makes them conform, that makes them serve the group even when the group is serving power, is maintaining hierarchy, is preserving the order that benefits the few at the expense of the many, and the many are controlled through shame, are kept in place through guilt, are made to believe that their suffering is their fault, is their failure, is their unworthiness, and the unworthiness is the lie, is the mechanism, is the currency of shame, is what keeps the system running, what makes power invisible, what converts coercion into choice. And the choice is not free but is shaped by shame, by guilt, by the fear of judgment, by the anticipation of exposure, by the threat that is always there, always present, always ready to descend. And the descending is what everyone fears, is what everyone avoids, is what everyone works to prevent. And the preventing is the work, is the performance, is the conformity, is the submission, is the acceptance of the norms, the internalization of the judgment, the absorption of the shame that is the currency, that is the mechanism, that is the way that societies control, that power maintains itself, that individuals are shaped into members of the group. And the shaping is violence, is coercion, is the transformation of the self into the thing that the group needs. And the need is conformity, is obedience, is the willingness to carry the shame, to feel the guilt, to be the subject of judgment. And the subject is what shame creates, is what guilt produces, is the self that is never free, never acceptable, never beyond the reach of the currency that is shame, that is guilt, that is the mechanism through which humanity controls itself, enforces its norms, maintains its order, and the order is maintained through suffering, through the feeling that is unbearable, through the emotion that is technology, through the currency of shame. Certainty became the sin, became the transgression that was punished, became the sign of pride, of arrogance, of the refusal to acknowledge limitation, and this society built its entire structure around the opposite value, around the celebration of error, around the sanctification of being wrong, around the belief that mistakes were not failures, but were revelations, were demonstrations of humility, were proof that the person was acknowledging their limitations, was accepting their fallibility, was recognizing that knowledge is always provisional, always uncertain, always potentially mistaken, and the mistaken became sacred, became the thing to aspire to, became the marker of virtue, and virtue in this society was not being right but was being willing to be wrong, was not knowing but was doubting, was not certainty but was the constant acknowledgement that certainty is impossible, that knowledge is limited, that every belief could be false, and the false became celebrated, became honoured, became the thing that festivals commemorated, that rituals enacted, that the entire culture was organised around, and the organising was systematic, was creating institutions that rewarded error, that punished correctness, that inverted all the normal incentives, all the usual values, all the expected responses to being right or wrong, and wrong became right, became the goal, became what people strived for, and striving for error became the highest calling, became the most virtuous path, became the way to demonstrate epistemic humility, to show that one was not claiming to possess truth, was not asserting certainty, was not committing the sin of believing oneself to be correct, and correct became immoral, became the sign of pride, became evidence of having failed to recognize one's own fallibility. And fallibility was the central doctrine, was the core belief, was the foundation on which the entire society was built. The recognition that humans are limited, are prone to error, are incapable of achieving certainty, and that any claim to certainty is therefore false, is therefore sinful, is therefore requiring punishment, requiring correction through the celebration of incorrectness, through the ritual acknowledgement of error, through the systematic inversion of the values that make being right desirable and being wrong shameful, and the shameful became sacred, became the thing to be proud of, became the demonstration of virtue, and virtue was being wrong, was making mistakes, was celebrating failures, and failures were what the society honoured, were what the festivals commemorated, were what the rituals enacted, and the enacting was elaborate, was involving public confessions of correctness, public acknowledgements of having believed something that turned out to be true, public expressions of shame for having been right, and being right was the transgression, was the sin, was what required confession, required penance, required the ritual humiliation of admitting that one had failed to be sufficiently humble, had failed to doubt enough, had failed to recognize the possibility of error, and the possibility was what the society insisted upon, was what the doctrine required, was the constant acknowledgement that everything believed could be wrong, that every claim could be false, that certainty is impossible, and that any feeling of certainty is delusion, is pride, is the sin that must be punished through the celebration of error, through the festival of failures, through the systematic rewarding of being wrong and the systematic punishment of being right. And right became wrong, became the thing to avoid, became the sign of having failed morally, of having committed the sin of certainty. And certainty was the ultimate transgression, was the worst sin, was what the society could not tolerate, could not accept, could not allow to persist, and the persistence of certainty was met with exile, with exclusion, with the removal from the community of those who insisted they were right, who claimed to know, who refused to acknowledge the possibility of error, and error was what the community demanded, was what membership required, was the price of belonging, and belonging meant accepting that one was wrong, that one's beliefs were false, that one's knowledge was limited, and the limited was celebrated, was honoured, was the virtue that made the society cohere, that made the culture function, that created the bonds between members who were united in their shared fallibility, in their collective acknowledgement of limitation, in their mutual celebration of error, and error became the bond, became what connected people, became what made the society possible. And the possible was a form of life that was radically different from others. That was inverting the normal values, that was making sacred what others made profane, that was celebrating what others lamented, that was honouring what others punished. And the punishment in this society was for being right, was for claiming correctness, was for displaying certainty. And certainty was the crime, was the transgression, was what could not be tolerated. And the toleration was only for error, only for doubt, only for the constant acknowledgement of fallibility. And fallibility was the doctrine, was the belief, was the foundation, and the foundation was stable, was solid, was maintaining the society for generations, for centuries, for the entire duration of its existence. And the existence was marked by the festival of failures, by the annual celebration of the greatest mistakes, of the most spectacular errors, of the claims that had been most confidently held and most thoroughly disproven. And the disproof was the achievement, was the accomplishment, was what was honoured in the festival. And the festival was elaborate, was involving performances of the errors, reenactments of the mistakes, public displays of the wrongness that had been achieved. And the achieving was intentional, was the result of effort, was the work of those who were striving to be wrong, who were seeking error, who were trying to make claims that would be false. And the false was difficult to achieve reliably, was requiring effort, was not happening automatically, because even in a society that celebrates error, even in a culture that sanctifies mistake, the tendency toward accuracy persists, the inclination toward truth remains. The unconscious processes that are trying to model reality correctly continue to operate, and the operating sometimes produces correctness, sometimes generates accuracy, sometimes results in beliefs that correspond to reality. And the correspondence was the problem, was the sin, was the transgression that required confession, required penance, required the public acknowledgement that one had been right. And being right was shameful, was evidence of failure, was proof that the person had not been sufficiently committed to error, had not tried hard enough to be wrong, had allowed accuracy to emerge, and the emergence was accidental, was unintended, was the result of the processes that make humans generally reliable at forming true beliefs, despite the society's best efforts to prevent this, despite the systematic rewarding of error and punishing of correctness, despite the entire structure being organized to celebrate mistake. The truth kept emerging, kept appearing, kept being accidentally discovered. And the discovery was the crisis, was the problem, was what the society did not know how to handle. Because the doctrine said that truth was unknowable, that certainty was impossible, that every belief was potentially false. But what happens when a belief is clearly true, when the accuracy is undeniable, when the correspondence between claim and reality is obvious to everyone? And the obvious is what created the crisis, is what produced the schism, is what happened when someone in the society got something right by accident, made a claim that was intended to be false, that was designed to demonstrate fallibility, that was meant to be an error, but turned out to be correct, turned out to be true, turned out to correspond to reality in ways that could not be denied. And the denial was attempted, was the first response, was the effort to maintain the doctrine by insisting that the claim was still wrong, was still false, was still demonstrating error, even though the evidence showed otherwise. And the evidence was overwhelming, was undeniable, was forcing the society to confront the fact that sometimes people are right, that sometimes beliefs are true, that sometimes knowledge is achieved, and the achievement was the problem, was the crisis, was what the doctrine could not accommodate. Because if someone could be right, could be correct, could know something with certainty, then the entire foundation was threatened. The entire structure was unstable. The entire culture was built on a premise that was being challenged, and the challenge came not from outside, not from critics, not from enemies, but from within, from the accidental discovery of truth, from the unintended achievement of correctness, from the mistake of being right in a society that celebrated being wrong. And being wrong was no longer possible for this claim, was no longer achievable for this belief, was no longer something that could be maintained in the face of the evidence. And the evidence was what created the split, was what divided the society, was what produced the factions, one insisting that the doctrine must be maintained, that error must still be celebrated even in the face of apparent truth, that the claim must somehow be wrong even though it appears to be right, and the other faction arguing that the doctrine itself was an error, was itself a mistake, was itself something that should be celebrated for being wrong, and the wrong was what the doctrine was about error, was about the impossibility of certainty, was about the necessity of doubt. And if the doctrine itself was wrong, then being wrong about being wrong was being right about being right, was vindicating the value of correctness, was showing that truth was possible, that certainty could be achieved, that knowledge was not always provisional, and that always was what was challenged, was what the crisis threatened, was what the accidental correctness undermined, and the undermining led to collapse, led to fragmentation, led to the dissolution of the society that had been held together by the shared celebration of error, by the collective acknowledgement of fallibility, by the mutual honouring of mistake. And the mistake that destroyed them was being right, was achieving accuracy, was discovering truth. And the truth was that error was not always achievable, that correctness sometimes emerged despite efforts to prevent it, that reality imposed itself despite the doctrine, despite the culture, despite the systematic attempts to celebrate wrongness. And wrongness was no longer universal, was no longer guaranteed, was no longer the shared condition that made the society cohere, and the coherence dissolved, was lost, was replaced by conflict between those who insisted on maintaining the doctrine and those who argued that the doctrine had been proven wrong by the very success of someone being right. And the success was accidental, was unintended, was the crisis that destroyed the cult that worshipped being wrong, that celebrated mistake, that made error sacred. And sacred was what being wrong had been, was what the society had made it, was what the culture had enforced, but the enforcement failed, was overcome, was shown to be impossible when truth emerged despite the efforts to suppress it, when correctness appeared despite the attempts to prevent it, when someone got something right by accident and the accident revealed that being wrong was not always possible, that error was not always achievable, that the doctrine itself was mistaken, was fallible, was demonstrating the very thing it claimed was universal, which was that all beliefs can be wrong, including the belief that all beliefs can be wrong, and the wrong about wrong was right about right, was showing that correctness was possible, that truth could be known, that certainty could be achieved, at least about some things, at least sometimes, at least in the case that destroyed the cult, that dissolved the society, that ended the celebration of error by demonstrating that error was not the only option, that being right was possible, that truth existed, and the existence of truth was what the cult could not tolerate, could not accommodate, could not integrate into the doctrine, and the doctrine was abandoned, was rejected, was shown to be wrong, and being wrong about the celebration of being wrong was the final irony, was the ultimate demonstration of fallibility, was the proof that even the systematic celebration of error could itself be an error, could itself be mistaken, could itself be wrong, and wrong was what the cult was about being, was what they celebrated, was what they made sacred. So being wrong about the value of being wrong should have been celebrated, should have been honoured, should have been the greatest achievement, but instead it was the crisis, was the problem, was the thing that could not be integrated, could not be accepted, could not be celebrated because it undermined everything, because it showed that the doctrine was not just wrong, but was impossibly wrong, was self-refuting, was demonstrating through its own wrongness that wrongness was not the highest value, was not the ultimate virtue, was not the thing to be celebrated, and the celebration ended, was terminated, was replaced by confusion, by conflict, by the dissolution of the society that had been held together by the shared commitment to error. And the error that destroyed them was the error of believing that error was always achievable, was always possible, was always superior to correctness, and the superiority was the claim, was the doctrine, was the foundation that collapsed when someone was accidentally right and the accident revealed that rightness was possible, that truth existed, that certainty could be achieved, and the achievement destroyed the cult that worshipped being wrong, that celebrated mistake, that made error sacred, and sacred was what it had been, was what the society had made it, but the making was unmade, was dissolved, was ended by the accidental truth, by the unintended correctness, by the crisis of being right in a society that celebrated being wrong. And being wrong was no longer the only option, was no longer the shared condition, was no longer the bond that held the society together. And together they had been, united in error, committed to mistake, celebrating failure. But the celebration ended when failure failed, when error erred, when wrongness was wrong, and wrong about wrongness was right about rightness, was showing that the doctrine was mistaken, that the cult was in error, that the worship of being wrong was itself wrong. And wrong about wrong is right, is correctness, is truth, and truth destroyed the cult, dissolved the society, ended the celebration, and the ending was the result of accident, of unintended correctness, of someone being right when they meant to be wrong, and being right destroyed everything, revealed the doctrine to be false, showed the cult to be mistaken, demonstrated that error was not always possible, that correctness sometimes emerged, that truth existed despite the celebration of mistake, and the mistake was worshipping mistake, was celebrating error, was making wrongness sacred, and sacred it was until it was shown to be wrong, until the doctrine was proven false, until the cult collapsed because someone was accidentally right, and being right was the sin, was the transgression, was the mistake that could not be forgiven, could not be celebrated, could not be integrated, and the integration failed, the society dissolved, the cult ended, and what remained was the memory of the society that celebrated being wrong, that worshipped mistake, that made error sacred, and sacred it was until truth emerged, until correctness appeared, until someone was accidentally right, and the accident destroyed everything, ended the cult, dissolved the society, terminated the celebration of being wrong. And wrong was what they were about being, was what they celebrated, was what destroyed them, when they were wrong about it, when the doctrine itself was error, when the worship was mistake, and mistake was what ended it, was what dissolved it, was what revealed that being wrong about being wrong is being right about being right, and right destroyed them, ended them, dissolved the cult that worshipped being wrong. The self that is presented to others is not the self that exists in private, is not the unfiltered consciousness that experiences doubt and desire, and the raw sensations that never make it into words, and this gap between inner and outer, between what is felt and what is performed, is not deception in the usual sense, is not dishonesty or manipulation, though it can become those things, is rather the fundamental structure of social existence, the way that human beings must translate the chaos of subjective experience into forms that others can recognize, can respond to, can incorporate into their own understanding. And this translation is always a performance, always a presentation of self that is shaped by audience, by context, by the roles that are available, by the scripts that culture provides. And the person performing is usually unaware of performing, usually believes that the presented self is the real self, that the role is identity, that the mask is the face. And this belief is necessary, is what makes the performance convincing. Because a performance that is known to be performance breaks the illusion, creates distance, makes interaction awkward. And so the actor must forget they are acting, must inhabit the role so completely that it feels natural, feels spontaneous, feels like authenticity. Even though authenticity is itself a performance, is itself a role that can be played well or badly. And the irony is that the pursuit of authenticity, the desire to be real, to be genuine, to present the true self, often produces the most theatrical performances, the most carefully curated presentations, because authenticity has become a value, has become something to be achieved. And achievement requires effort, requires strategy, requires the very calculation that authenticity is supposed to transcend. And so people perform authenticity, perform vulnerability, perform the disclosure of inner experience in ways that are designed to elicit specific responses, to create specific impressions. And the performance is so smooth, so practiced, that it does not feel like performance. It feels instead like courage, like honesty, like the removal of masks, when really it is just a different mask, just a different role, the role of the authentic person. And this role has its own rules, its own expectations, its own ways of being performed correctly. And those who perform it well are rewarded with trust, with intimacy, with the sense that they are real in a way that others are not. But the reality is constructed, is as much a presentation as any other, is distinguished only by the fact that it is currently valued, currently believed to be the marker of genuine selfhood. And in another time, another culture, a different performance would be valued, a different role would signify authenticity, and the self would adapt, would learn the new script, would perform the new role with the same conviction, the same sense of being true to something essential. And this adaptability reveals that there is no essential self, no core identity that exists independent of performance, only the capacity to perform, the ability to take on roles, to switch between them, to present different faces to different audiences. And this switching is not pathological, is not evidence of fragmentation or disorder, is simply the normal operation of social cognition, the way that human beings navigate the complex demands of living among others, who have expectations, who assign meaning to behaviour, who respond not to inner states but to outer presentations. And the outer must be managed, must be controlled, must be performed in ways that produce the desired effects. And the desired effects vary by situation, by relationship, by goal. And so the self that is presented varies as well, is different at work than at home, different with friends than with strangers, different in public than in private. And each version feels real in the moment, feels like the self, but the multiplicity suggests that the self is not a thing but a process, not an entity but an activity, the activity of presenting, of performing, of managing the impression that others form. And this management is constant, is exhausting, is the hidden labour that underlies all social interaction, the work of monitoring how one is being received, adjusting tone and posture and expression to match the demands of the situation, suppressing impulses that would be inappropriate, amplifying qualities that are valued. And this work is largely unconscious, is automatic, is the result of years of training in how to be a person, how to perform the role that culture assigns. And the training begins in childhood, begins with the learning of language, of gesture, of the countless small behaviours that signal membership, that indicate understanding of the rules, and children who fail to learn these behaviours, who cannot perform the expected roles, are marked as strange, as other, as outside the social order. And the marking is punishment, is exclusion, is the withdrawal of recognition. And recognition is what makes selfhood possible, is the confirmation that the performance is successful, that the presented identity is accepted, is real. And without recognition, the self becomes unstable, becomes uncertain, becomes desperate for validation, for proof that it exists. And this desperation drives performance, drives the endless adjustment and refinement of presentation, drives the pursuit of authenticity that is really the pursuit of recognition, the desire to be seen, to be known, to be confirmed in one's existence by the gaze of another. And the gaze is selective, is interpretive, sees not what is actually there, but what it expects to see, what it has been trained to see by culture, by category, by stereotype. And the person being gazed upon knows this, adjusts accordingly, performs the role that the gaze expects or deliberately subverts it, performs the opposite, performs resistance, but resistance is also performance, is also a role. The role of the rebel, the nonconformist, the authentic individual who refuses to play the game. And this refusal is its own game, its own set of rules, its own performance that must be maintained. And the maintenance is exhausting, is perhaps more exhausting than conformity, because it requires constant vigilance, constant assertion of difference, constant performance of not performing. And the paradox is that the more one tries to escape performance, the more theatrical the presentation becomes. The more calculated the spontaneity, the more rehearsed the authenticity, and there is no escape from this paradox, no way to be social without performing. Because sociality is performance, is the presentation of self to others in forms that can be recognized, and recognition requires forms, requires categories, requires roles that are shared, that are understood, that carry meaning beyond the individual. And the individual is always exceeding these categories, is always more complex than any role can contain, is always feeling things that cannot be expressed, thinking things that cannot be said, experiencing a richness of inner life that the performance necessarily simplifies, necessarily reduces. And this reduction is the cost of being understood, the price of social existence. And the question is whether the price is worth paying, whether the recognition gained is worth the self that is lost. And the answer varies, is different for different people at different times. And some find the performance liberating, find relief in the structure, in the clarity of roles, in the ability to step into a character and leave the chaos of unmediated experience behind. And others find it suffocating, find the roles too constraining, the masks too heavy, the gap between inner and outer too painful. And these are the ones who talk about authenticity, who long for genuine connection, who want to be seen as they really are. But what they really are is not something that can be seen, is not something that can be presented, is only something that can be lived. And lived experience is private, is immediate, is lost in the translation to performance, and so the longing for authenticity is a longing for the impossible, for a form of recognition that would not require form, for a connection that would not require mediation, for a self that could be known without being performed. And this self does not exist, has never existed, is a fiction, is the romantic myth of the true self that lurks beneath the social surface, waiting to be discovered, to be liberated, to be expressed. But there is no beneath. There is no depth where the true self resides. There is only surface, only performance, only the endless presentation of forms that are more or less successful, more or less satisfying, more or less exhausting. And the exhaustion is real, is the inevitable result of constant performance, of the effort required to maintain coherence, to present a self that is consistent across contexts, that makes sense as a character, that can be narrated as a story. And the story is always being edited, always being revised, always adjusting to new information, to new audiences, to new demands. And the editing is not optional, is not something that can be refused without cost. Because the cost is unintelligibility, is the failure to make sense, is the breakdown of social recognition. And without recognition, the self dissolves, becomes nothing, becomes the raw experiencing that has no form, no identity, no place in the social world. And the social world is the only world there is the only context in which selfhood is possible. And so the performance continues, must continue, is the condition of being human, of being a creature that exists not alone but among others, not in isolation but in relationship. And relationship requires presentation, requires the management of impressions, requires what Irving Goffman called dramaturgy, the theatrical metaphor for social life, the idea that all interaction is performance, that every encounter has a front stage where the performance happens and a backstage where the actor prepares, and the backstage is not more real than the front stage, is not where the true self resides, is simply where a different performance happens. The performance of relaxation, of letting down the guard, of being off duty, but this too is performed, is presented to those who are allowed backstage, who are granted access to the private self, and the private self is itself public in a different way, is itself a presentation designed for a specific audience, the audience of intimities, of those who are supposed to see the unguarded version, and the unguarded version is still guarded, is still shaped by expectations, by the desire to be seen in a particular way, by the need to maintain certain impressions, even in intimacy, especially in intimacy, because intimacy is where the stakes are highest, where the performance matters most, where failure to maintain character can destroy relationships, can shatter the trust that depends on consistency, on the beloved being who they claim to be, on the friend being recognizable, on the self being stable enough to be relied upon. And stability requires performance, requires the suppression of variability, the editing out of contradictions, the maintenance of a coherent narrative that makes the self intelligible as a character. And characters are not people, are simplifications, are abstractions, are the reduction of complexity to manageable form, and the management is necessary, is what makes interaction possible, but it comes at a cost. The cost of everything that does not fit the character, everything that contradicts the narrative, everything that would make the self less coherent, less consistent, less recognizable, and what does not fit is suppressed, is hidden, is relegated to the back regions of consciousness where it cannot disrupt the performance. And sometimes the suppression is so successful that the performer forgets what has been suppressed, loses access to the parts of experience that do not fit the role. And this forgetting is adaptive, is functional, is what allows the performance to be convincing, to be believed by others and by the self. But it creates a split, creates the sense that something is missing, that the performed self is incomplete, is not capturing everything. And this sense drives the search for authenticity, drives the belief that there is a true self, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be expressed. But what is found when the search is pursued is not a true self, but more performances, more roles, more ways of presenting that feel more or less authentic depending on how well they are received, on how much recognition they generate, on how satisfying the performance is to the performer. And satisfaction is not a property of the role itself, but of the response it elicits, of the confirmation it receives, of the way it makes the social world respond. And the response is what matters, is what makes performance meaningful, is what converts the theatrical into the real, because the real is not opposed to performance, but is produced by performance, is the effect of successful presentation, is what happens when the audience believes, when the role is inhabited so completely that it becomes indistinguishable from identity, and identity is not what the person is, but what the person is taken to be, what they are recognized as, what social position they occupy. And the occupation of position requires performance, requires the enactment of the behaviors associated with the position, and the behaviors must be performed correctly, or the position is lost. The identity is challenged, the self is thrown into crisis, and crisis is the breakdown of performance, is the moment when the role no longer works, when the script fails, when the audience refuses to play along. And these moments are revealing, are glimpses of the machinery behind the presentation, are proof that the self is constructed rather than discovered, is maintained rather than simply existing. And the maintenance is work, is constant work, is the hidden labour that everyone performs, but no one acknowledges, because acknowledging it would break the illusion, would make it impossible to believe in the roles. And Belief is necessary, is what makes the performance effective, what makes social life possible, and so the work is hidden, is naturalized, is treated as if it were not work at all but simply being oneself. And being oneself is the most demanding performance of all, is the role that requires the greatest consistency, the most careful management, the most exhaustive monitoring, because the self is the character that must be maintained across all contexts, that must make sense as a continuous identity, despite the fact that it is constantly shifting, constantly adapting, constantly being performed differently for different audiences. And the audiences do not see the shifts, do not notice the code switching, the way the person becomes different when they move from one social context to another, the way they adjust accent and vocabulary and posture and attitude to match the expectations of each situation. And this adjustment is automatic, is unconscious, is learned so thoroughly that it feels natural, but it is performance, is the work of fitting in, of being appropriate, of presenting a self that will be accepted, and acceptance's survival is the condition of social existence. And those who cannot perform, who cannot adjust, who cannot present themselves in forms that others recognize and value, are excluded, are marginalized, are marked as failures, as problems, as people who cannot be understood. And understanding is recognition, is the confirmation that the performance has been received, has been interpreted correctly, has produced the intended effect, and the intended effect is always social, is always about positioning the self in relation to others, about claiming status, about asserting value, about demonstrating competence or vulnerability or power or need, depending on what the situation demands. And the demands are relentless, are changing, are requiring constant recalibration, constant adjustment of the performance to match new circumstances, new audiences, new expectations. And the exhaustion of this is cumulative, is building over time, is the reason why people speak of being tired of pretending, tired of performing, tired of maintaining the masks, and the desire to drop the masks is the desire to stop working, to stop performing, to simply be without the labour of presentation. But being without presentation is not possible, is not a coherent idea, because being is always for someone, is always in relation, is always already a presentation, even when it feels like pure existence. And the feeling of pure existence is itself a performance, is the role of the authentic person who has transcended roles. And this transcendence is another role, is perhaps the most demanding role, because it must be performed without seeming to be performed, must appear effortless while requiring tremendous effort, must seem natural while being highly artificial. And the artifice is what makes it work, is what makes authenticity convincing, is what allows the performance to succeed. And success is measured not by internal states but by external validation, by the response of others, by whether the performance is believed. And belief is what converts performance into reality, is what makes the presented self into the real self, is what allows people to say, "This is who I am," and mean it, even though who they are is what they are performing, is what they have learned to present, is what has been confirmed through recognition, and the confirmation is never final, is always provisional, is always requiring renewal, requiring continued performance, requiring the maintenance of character across time. And time reveals the instability of identity, reveals that the self is not fixed but fluid, not stable but shifting, not essential but contingent, contingent on circumstances, on audiences, on the roles that are available, on the scripts that can be enacted. And when the scripts fail, when the roles become unavailable, when the audience changes, the self changes with it, becomes someone else, performs a different character. And this transformation can be smooth or traumatic depending on how much is invested in the previous identity, on how deeply the role has been internalized, on whether the person believes they are the role or knows they are performing it. And knowing does not make the performance less real, but it does make it less rigid, makes it possible to change without crisis, to adopt new roles without losing the sense of continuity. And continuity is the narrative thread that connects performances, that makes the self coherent across transformations, that allows someone to say, I have changed, but I am still me. And the still me is the story, is the interpretation that makes the changes make sense, that integrates them into a single life, a single identity, and the integration is retrospective, is always looking back and reinterpreting the past in light of the present. Making the past make sense as preparation for who one is now, and who one is now is who one is performing now, is the current role, the current presentation, and this will change, will be different. In a year, in a decade, will be looked back upon as another version, another performance, in the long series of performances that constitute a life. And the life is not the sum of these performances, but the narrative that connects them, the story that makes them cohere, and the story is itself a performance, is the presentation of a life as meaningful, as directed, as having purpose and continuity, when really it is just one thing after another, just a series of moments that are connected by memory and interpretation, not by any underlying essence, not by any true self that persists through change. And the absence of essence is not a problem, is not a lack, is simply the human condition, is what it means to be a creature that exists socially, that depends on recognition, that has no identity outside of performance, outside of the presentations that are received and confirmed and converted into reality through the collective agreement that this performance counts, that this role is real, that this person is who they claim to be. And the claim is always a performance, is always a presentation that could be otherwise, that could be challenged, that could be refused, and the refusal would unmake the identity, would leave the person without form, without recognition, without a place in the social order. And this is the terror that keeps performance going, that makes authenticity impossible and necessary at the same time, that ensures the exhaustion will continue, the masks will be maintained, the roles will be performed, because the alternative is not freedom but dissolution, not authenticity but unintelligibility, not the true self, but no self at all, and no self is what humans cannot tolerate, cannot survive, cannot be. And so they perform, must perform, will always perform, and the performance is not false but is what makes truth possible, is what makes identity possible, is what makes the social world possible. And the social world is the only world where selves exist, where persons are real, where the question of who someone is can be answered. And the answer is always a performance, is always a presentation, is always theatre. And the theatre is not opposed to reality, but is where reality happens, is where selves are made and unmade and remade, is where the human drama unfolds. And the drama is not pretense, but is the substance of social existence, is what people are when they're together, is what life looks like from the outside, from the position of the audience that is also performing, that is also presenting, that is also caught in the same machinery of recognition and validation and exhaustion. And the exhaustion is shared, is universal, is the common condition of beings who must perform to exist, who must present to be recognized, who must work to be real. And the work never ends, never arrives at completion, never achieves the authenticity it seeks. Because authenticity is not a destination, but another performance, another role in the endless repertoire of human self-presentation. And the repertoire is all there is what the self is made of, is the material from which identity is constructed, and the construction is ongoing, is never finished, is always being revised and updated and performed anew. And the performance is life, is what it means to be human, is the condition that cannot be escaped or transcended, but only inhabited, only enacted, only performed with more or less grace, more or less awareness, more or less exhaustion. and the exhaustion is the price, is what is paid for social existence, for recognition, for the privilege of having an identity at all. And the price is worth paying because the alternative is unthinkable, is the void where no performance reaches, where no audience sees, where no self exists because there is no one to confirm it, no one to recognize it, no one to make it real. And real is what performance does, is the achievement of successful presentation, is the magic of theatre that converts pretense into truth, converts acting into being, converts the performed self into the only self there is. And there is no other, never was, never will be, only the masks and the wearing of them and the exhaustion of maintaining them, and the belief, necessary and false and true all at once, that somewhere beneath the performance there is something real, something authentic, something that is not performing, and this belief keeps the performance going, keeps the search alive, keeps people presenting and adjusting and performing and exhausting themselves in the endless work of being someone, of being anyone at all. Balancing intuition and theory. There is a method in philosophy that claims to find truth not by discovering foundations, not by building from self-evident axioms, not by appealing to revelation or pure reason, but by seeking coherence, by adjusting beliefs until they fit together, by moving back and forth between particular judgments and general principles until a stable equilibrium is reached. And this method is called reflective equilibrium, and it was developed most fully by John Rawls in his work on justice, though the idea stretches back through the history of philosophy, back to the recognition that neither pure theory nor pure intuition can be trusted alone, that each must constrain and correct the other. That truth emerges from their interaction rather than from either in isolation. The process begins with considered judgments, with the moral intuitions people have about particular cases. Intuitions like slavery is wrong, promise breaking requires justification, causing unnecessary suffering is bad, and these intuitions are the raw material, the data that ethical theory must account for, but they are not infallible, not sacrosanct, not immune to revision. They are provisional starting points that might be mistaken, might be the product of bias or prejudice or limited understanding, and the method acknowledges this, acknowledges that intuitions can be wrong while still insisting they are the only place to start, the only access we have to moral reality, because if we do not begin with intuitions, then where do we begin? What other source of moral knowledge is there? And the answer seems to be none. No pure reason that delivers ethical truths, no perception that reveals moral facts, no authority that can be trusted without question. Only the messy collection of judgments people make about cases, judgments that often conflict, that differ across cultures, that change over time, and yet somehow, from this unpromising material, moral philosophy must be constructed. Rawls distinguished between narrow and wide reflective equilibrium. Narrow equilibrium is achieved when particular judgments and general principles are brought into coherence with each other, but nothing else. When the theory fits the intuitions and the intuitions fit the theory, but no attention is paid to alternative theories, to background beliefs, to empirical facts about human nature or social organization. And this is relatively easy to achieve, but not very stable, not very trustworthy, because it might be that another theory fits the intuitions just as well, might be that the intuitions themselves rest on false empirical beliefs, might be that the whole system is coherent but disconnected from reality. A beautiful castle built on sand and wide equilibrium tries to avoid this by expanding the scope of what must cohere, by requiring that the theory fit not just with moral intuitions but with considered beliefs about psychology, about society, about human nature, with alternative moral theories that have been seriously considered and rejected for good reasons. And this makes equilibrium harder to achieve, but more robust, more likely to track truth rather than merely achieve internal consistency, because it forces the theorist to confront challenges, to test the theory against competitors, to ensure that coherence is not just local, but global, not just moral, but includes everything the person believes. But this raises an immediate problem, the problem of whether intuitions are really data, whether they deserve the role rules assigns them, whether they are observations of moral reality or merely expressions of cultural conditioning, of evolutionary adaptation, of psychological bias. And if intuitions are not perceptions of moral facts, but products of contingent causal processes, then why should they constrain theory at all? Why not just construct moral theory from scratch using pure reason, using consistency and simplicity and other theoretical virtues, and let the intuitions fall where they may? And some philosophers have argued exactly this, have argued that intuitions are unreliable, that they differ too much across individuals and cultures to be evidence, that they are shaped by factors that have nothing to do with truth, by emotion and self-interest and social pressure. And if this is right, then reflective equilibrium is not a method for discovering moral truth, but for rationalizing prejudice, for systematizing whatever intuitions one happens to have, for building coherent theories that reflect nothing more than the contingent moral psychology of the theorist. Rawls was aware of this objection. He restricted the relevant intuitions to considered judgments made under favourable conditions, when the person is calm and informed and has no personal stake in the outcome, when they are not distracted by irrelevant factors, when they have thought carefully about the case, and this restriction is supposed to filter out the unreliable intuitions, the ones produced by bias or emotion or confusion, and leave only the reliable ones, the ones that are genuinely responsive to moral reality. But critics ask how we know which intuitions are made under favourable conditions, how we distinguish the reliable from the unreliable without already having a moral theory. And if we need a theory to identify good intuitions, then we cannot use intuitions to build the theory. We are reasoning in a circle, using theory to select data and data to support theory. And this circularity seems vicious, seems to undermine the entire method, because it means we can get any result we want just by choosing the right intuitions, by labeling the intuitions that fit our preferred theory as considered judgments and dismissing the rest as unreliable. And there is no independent check, no way to break into the circle from outside, no neutral standpoint from which to evaluate whether the equilibrium reached tracks truth or merely reflects the prejudices we started with. Goodman faced a similar problem in the philosophy of science with his work on induction. He argued that inductive rules are justified by their conformity to accepted inductive inferences, and accepted inferences are justified by their conformity to rules. And this seems circular in the same way, seems to justify induction by appeal to induction. But Goodman argued the circularity was not vicious but virtuous, that this is how justification works, not by reduction to foundations but by mutual support, by coherence among elements, none of which are independently justified, but which together form a stable system. And Rawls borrowed this idea, applied it to ethics, argued that moral theory is justified the same way, not by derivation from self-evident principles, but by coherence with considered judgments. And just as scientific method is justified by its success in producing reliable predictions and explanations, moral theory is justified by its success in organizing and explaining moral phenomena, in capturing what is right about our intuitions while correcting what is wrong. And this is not circular reasoning, but reflective reasoning, reasoning that loops back on itself, that uses its own outputs as inputs, that gradually refines itself through iteration. And the result is not certainty, but reasonable confidence, not proof, but the best we can do given our epistemic situation, given that we are finite creatures trying to understand domains that exceed our individual capacities. But the analogy to science is controversial because science has a reality check, has observation and experiment, has ways of testing theories against the world that do not depend entirely on coherence. And ethics lacks this, has no moral microscope, no way to observe moral facts independently of intuition. And if intuitions are all we have, then coherence among them is just coherence among beliefs, is not evidence of truth, but only evidence of consistency. And many philosophers have argued that this is not enough, that ethics needs something more than reflective equilibrium, needs some external constraint, some connection to reality that goes beyond mere coherence. And this is where moral realism enters. The view that there are objective moral facts independent of human belief, facts that make moral judgments true or false. And the realist thinks reflective equilibrium might accidentally hit on truth, but cannot guarantee it, cannot ensure that the equilibrium reached corresponds to reality rather than just organizing our prejudices into a coherent system, while the anti-realist thinks there are no moral facts, that all ethics can do is organize intuitions into coherent systems, and reflective equilibrium is the best method available because it is the only method available, because there is nothing beyond coherence to aim for. Singer challenges reflective equilibrium from a different angle. He argues that many widely shared intuitions are simply wrong, are products of speciesism or other biases, and that a good moral theory should reject these intuitions rather than accommodate them, should revise our judgments radically rather than merely refining them. And if Singer is right, then reflective equilibrium is too conservative, too wedded to existing intuitions, too reluctant to overturn established moral beliefs. And the method will never lead to radical moral progress, will never challenge deeply held prejudices, will only produce theories that ratify the status quo with minor modifications. And this seems like a serious problem, because the history of ethics is a history of moral progress, of learning that practices once thought acceptable were actually wrong, of expanding the moral circle to include those previously excluded, and this progress often required rejecting intuitions that seemed obvious to earlier generations, rejecting the intuition that women were inferior, that slavery was natural, that animals had no moral status, and if these intuitions had been treated as data to be preserved in reflective equilibrium, then moral progress would have been impossible. The method would have locked in the prejudices of the age rather than enabling their critique. Rawls responds that reflective equilibrium does allow for revision of intuitions, that the process is not conservative but dialectical, that general principles can lead us to reject particular judgments when they conflict, that the equilibrium reached might be quite distant from the intuitions we started with, and he points to his own theory of justice, which leads to conclusions many people find counterintuitive, which argues for principles that would radically transform existing social arrangements. And this shows that the method does not simply ratify existing beliefs, but can challenge them, can lead to revisionary conclusions. But the question remains whether it can challenge them enough, whether the method is capable of truly radical critique, or whether it is always pulled back toward the mainstream by the weight of established intuitions, by the requirement that theory accommodate at least some of our considered judgments. And if it cannot accommodate any judgments, then what is the point of reflective equilibrium? Why not just do pure moral theory without regard for intuitions? And this is the tension at the heart of the method, the need to respect intuitions while remaining open to revising them, the need to start somewhere while acknowledging that the starting point might be entirely wrong. Parfit distinguished between two kinds of moral theorizing: bottom-up theorizing that starts with intuitions and builds principles to explain them, and top-down theorizing that starts with principles and derives conclusions regardless of whether they match intuitions. And reflective equilibrium is supposed to be neither purely bottom-up nor purely top-down, but a combination, a method that moves in both directions, that uses principles to test intuitions and intuitions to test principles. But in practice, most philosophers lean one way or the other. Some trust intuitions more, and will reject theories that conflict with strong intuitions, no matter how elegant the theory, while others trust theory more and will reject intuitions no matter how strong, if the theory implies they're wrong. And this split reflects deeper disagreements about the nature of moral knowledge, about whether ethics is more like perception, where we observe facts, or more like mathematics, where we reason from axioms. And reflective equilibrium tries to split the difference, but might satisfy neither side, might be too rationalist for the intuitionists and too intuitionist for the rationalists, might be a compromise that inherits the weaknesses of both approaches without fully gaining the strengths of either. The theory-ladenness of observation is a problem in science, and an even bigger problem in ethics, because intuitions are not neutral observations, but are shaped by the theories we already hold, by the concepts we use, by the categories we think in, and this means that intuitions cannot serve as independent checks on theory, because they are already contaminated by theory, are already expressions of theoretical commitments rather than raw data. And when we achieve reflective equilibrium between intuitions and theory, we might just be finding coherence between a theory and the intuitions that theory itself generated. We are making the theory consistent with its own implications rather than with independent reality. And this is not a test, not a confirmation, not evidence of truth. It is just circular reasoning dressed up as a method. And the only way to break the circle would be to have theory-neutral intuitions, intuitions that are not shaped by any theoretical commitments. But such intuitions might not exist, might be impossible, because all judgment requires concepts, and all concepts embody theoretical assumptions, and this means we are trapped inside our conceptual schemes, unable to step outside them to check whether they correspond to reality, unable to do anything but reorganize them into more or less coherent patterns. Neurath's boat is the metaphor often used here. The idea that we are like sailors who must rebuild their ship while at sea, who cannot return to dry dock, who must stand on some planks while replacing others, who can never inspect the whole. Structure at once, but must trust that the parts they are not currently working on are sound enough to support them, and reflective equilibrium is like this, is a process of revising beliefs, while standing on other beliefs, of using some judgments to evaluate others without ever having a belief-free standpoint, without ever achieving the kind of foundation that traditional epistemology sought. And this seems precarious, seems to offer no guarantee of truth, seems to allow for the possibility that the entire system could be coherent but false, that we could achieve perfect equilibrium while being radically wrong about everything. And defenders of the method acknowledge this possibility, but argue it is unavoidable, argue that there is no alternative, that all reasoning is like this, that the demand for foundations is a mistake, that coherence is not a second-best substitute for foundation, but the only kind of justification there is. And we must either accept this or give up on justification entirely, give up on the possibility of distinguishing better from worse beliefs. And this is not acceptable. So we must accept reflective equilibrium, despite its limitations, despite its circularity, despite its inability to guarantee truth. The method has been applied beyond ethics, has been used in epistemology and metaphysics, and even in empirical sciences, wherever there is a need to balance theory and data, wherever neither can be trusted absolutely, wherever truth seems to emerge from coherence rather than correspondence. And this generalization suggests the method captures something deep about human reasoning, something about how finite creatures with limited access to reality must navigate uncertainty, must construct understanding from partial and fallible materials, must accept that justification is always provisional, always subject to revision, always dependent on a network of beliefs that might themselves need revision. And this is not skepticism, not the claim that we cannot know anything, but fallibilism, the claim that we can know things but cannot know them with certainty, cannot eliminate the possibility of error, cannot achieve the kind of absolute justification that philosophers once sought but must settle for something weaker, something more human, something that acknowledges our limitations, while still insisting that some beliefs are better justified than others, that some theories fit the evidence better than others, that coherence matters even if it does not guarantee truth. The psychological research on moral intuitions complicates the picture further, because it shows that intuitions are fast, automatic, emotionally laden judgments that often precede reasoning rather than result from it. That people typically judge first and justify later. That the reasoning we offer for moral judgments is often post hoc rationalization rather than the actual cause of the judgment. And if this is true, then reflective equilibrium is not a description of how moral thinking actually works, but a normative ideal, a recommendation for how it should work. And the question is whether this ideal is achievable, whether people can actually suspend their automatic judgments long enough to engage in the kind of reflective process Rawls describes, whether we can override our intuitions when theory demands it, or whether we are psychologically incapable of this, whether our reasoning is always in service of our intuitions rather than capable of genuinely evaluating them. And if we are psychologically incapable of genuine reflective equilibrium, then the method is not just difficult, but impossible, is an ideal that cannot be realized, and all actual moral theorizing is just rationalization of intuitions that we are stuck with, that we cannot revise no matter how much we reflect. And this would be a devastating conclusion, would suggest that moral philosophy is futile, that it cannot correct our biases because those biases are built into the very process of moral thought. But the research is contested, the interpretation is disputed, and many philosophers remain hopeful that reflection can genuinely revise intuition, that humans are capable of the kind of self-correction that reflective equilibrium requires, even if it is difficult, even if it goes against psychological grain, even if most people, most of the time, fail to achieve it. Putnam sat in a room and imagined two planets, identical in every way, except one, Earth and twin Earth, perfect mirrors of each other down to the last atom, the last thought, the last whispered word. And on Earth there is water, H2O, the molecule that makes up oceans and rivers and rain. And on twin Earth there is also water, but it is not H2O, it is XYZ, a completely different substance with different chemical structure, different molecular bonds, different properties at the microscopic level. Yet to everyone living on twin Earth it looks exactly like water, tastes exactly like water, behaves exactly like water. It fills their lakes and falls from their clouds and quenches their thirst just as water does on Earth. Now imagine two people, one on Earth and one on twin Earth. Call them both Oscar. And these two Oscars are molecule for molecule identical. Same brain structure, same neural patterns, same memories, same thoughts, same internal psychological states. Everything inside their heads is exactly the same. And both Oscars look at a glass of liquid and say the word water. They both think they are referring to the same thing. They both believe they know what water is, but Putnam asks a simple question that shatters centuries of philosophy. Are they actually referring to the same thing? And the answer is no. Earth Oscar's word water refers to H2O. Twin Earth Oscar's word water refers to XYZ. Same word, same internal mental state, but different meanings, different references, different extensions in the world. And this means that meaning is not determined by what is in the head. Meaning is not a function of internal psychological states. Meaning is not private, not subjective, not locked inside the skull waiting to be discovered through introspection. The tradition, before Putnam, stretching back through Locke and Hume and Descartes, believed that meanings were mental entities, that words were connected to ideas in the mind, that reference was mediated by internal representations, by concepts, by mental images, and if you wanted to know what someone meant by a word, you had to look inside their head, examine their thoughts, map their mental contents, and this made sense, it felt right. It aligned with the intuition that language is personal, that each person has their own private understanding of words, their own associations, their own mental dictionary. But Putnam showed that this entire picture was wrong, that two people could have identical mental contents and still mean different things by the same word. That meaning reaches beyond the skull, beyond the brain, beyond psychology entirely, into the world itself, into the environment, into the physical and social context that determines what words actually refer to. This is semantic externalism, the view that meanings are not in the head but out in the world. That reference is determined not by internal states but by external relations, by causal connections between words and things, by the history of how a word came to be used, by the community of speakers who share the word, by the natural kinds that exist independently of human thought. And this means that you can be wrong about what you mean. You can use a word your entire life and not know what it really refers to. You can have perfect confidence in your understanding and still be completely mistaken, because meaning is not something you possess. It is something you participate in, something that exists in the space between speakers and world, between language and reality, between words and the things they pick out. Putnam's argument did not stop at twin earth. He pushed further. He talked about the division of linguistic labour, the fact that most people do not know the technical details of what their words refer to. Most people cannot define gold in terms of atomic number, cannot distinguish an elm from a beech, cannot explain what makes aluminum different from molybdenum. Yet they use these words successfully. They refer to these things accurately, and they do so not because they have the right mental contents, but because they are embedded in a community where some people do have the expertise, where metallurgists know about aluminum, where botanists know about elms, where chemists know about gold. And when ordinary speakers use these words, they defer to the experts. They rely on the division of labour. They trust that somewhere in the linguistic community there are people who know what these words really mean, who can distinguish the real thing from the fake. And this trust is what allows language to function, what allows reference to succeed even in the absence of individual knowledge. This overturns the Cartesian picture entirely. Descartes believed that knowledge began with the self, with the contents of consciousness, with what could be known through introspection, and from there one built outward to knowledge of the world. But Putnam showed that the order is reversed, that knowledge of meaning requires knowledge of the world first, that you cannot know what you mean without knowing what your words refer to, and you cannot know what your words refer to just by looking inside your own mind. You have to look outside to the physical environment, to the social context, to the history of usage, to the experts who maintain the standards of reference. And this means that the self is not the foundation of knowledge, but a participant in a larger system, a node in a network of linguistic and social relations that determine meaning collectively, not individually, externally, not internally. Frege tried to solve the problem of meaning differently. He distinguished between sense and reference, between the mode of presentation and the thing presented, and he believed that sense was in the mind, that it mediated reference, that two people could refer to the same thing through different senses, like the morning star and the evening star, both referring to Venus, and this preserved the idea that meaning had a mental component, that internal states mattered. But Putnam's argument cut through this because on twin earth, Oscar and his counterpart have the same sense, the same mode of presentation, the same mental mediation, but they do not have the same reference. They are not talking about the same substance, and this means that sense alone does not determine reference, that no amount of mental content can fix what a word picks out in the world, that reference requires something beyond sense, beyond psychology, beyond anything that can be captured by introspection or phenomenology. Kripke reinforced this from another angle. He argued that names and natural kind terms were rigid designators, that they referred to the same thing in all possible worlds, not by virtue of satisfying a description, but by virtue of causal historical chains, that the word water refers to H2O because it was introduced to refer to a certain substance, and that reference was passed down through generations of speakers, through baptism and transmission, through ostension and use. And even if speakers lost track of what the substance was, even if they forgot its chemical composition, even if they developed false beliefs about it, the words still referred to the same thing, because reference is not determined by beliefs but by the causal connection between word and world, by the chain that links current usage back to the original act of naming, back to the moment when the word was first attached to the thing. This has radical implications for psychology, because it means psychology cannot determine reference, cannot tell you what your words mean, cannot give you the extension of your terms just by examining your mental states. And this was a blow to cognitive science, to theories of mind that tried to explain language purely in terms of internal representations, in terms of concepts and mental models and computational processes, because Putnam and Kripke showed that none of this is enough. That meaning leaks out of the head, that it requires the world, requires the community, requires the causal historical context, and without these external factors there is no meaning at all, just empty sounds, just syntax without semantics, just symbols shuffling around inside the skull with no connection to reality. Yet people resist this conclusion. They cling to the intuition that they know what they mean, that their words are transparent to them. That meaning is something they possess and control. And this resistance is understandable because semantic externalism is deeply unsettling. It suggests that we are strangers to our own language, that we do not fully understand the words we speak, that meaning is not something we create, but something we inherit, something we are thrown into, something that precedes us and exceeds us and determines what we can say before we even open our mouths. Wittgenstein saw this too, though from a different direction. He argued that meaning is use, that words get their meaning from the language games they are embedded in, from the forms of life that give them context, and he rejected the idea of private language, the idea that meaning could be purely internal, purely subjective, because a private language would have no standards of correctness, no way to distinguish between following a rule and merely thinking one is following a rule, and without standards there is no meaning, just the illusion of meaning, just the feeling of understanding without actual understanding. And this is why language must be public, why it must be shared, why it requires a community of speakers who can correct each other, who can point out mistakes, who can maintain the norms that make reference possible. Putnam took this further. He showed not just that language is public, but that meaning is not even fully determined by the community, that it reaches beyond the community into the world itself, that natural kind terms like water and gold and tiger refer to whatever has the same underlying nature as the paradigm samples, the same deep structure, the same essential properties, and this means that meaning can outrun knowledge, that a community can use a word correctly even when they have false beliefs about what they are referring to, even when their theories are wrong, even when their understanding is incomplete, because the word latches onto the real essence, the objective structure, the natural kind that exists independently of human thought. And the world itself constrains meaning, corrects mistakes, determines reference in ways that no internal psychological state can capture. This is why Aristotle was not wrong when he talked about water, even though he did not know about molecules, even though his theory of elements was false. He was still referring to H2O because his word water was causally connected to the same substance our word water refers to, because the reference was fixed not by his beliefs, but by the stuff itself, by the samples he pointed to, by the liquid he drank and swam in and observed, and the continuity of reference across theory change, across conceptual revolutions, across the abandonment of entire frameworks, shows that meaning is anchored in the world, not in the mind, that it survives the death of theories because it was never dependent on theories in the first place. But this raises a puzzle. If meaning is not in the head, if psychological states do not determine reference, then what role does the mind play at all? What is psychology supposed to study if not meaning, if not the contents of thought, if not the representations that mediate between language and world? And Putnam's answer is that psychology studies something real. It studies mental states. It studies computational processes. It studies the functional organization of cognition, but it does not study meaning, because meaning is not a psychological phenomenon. It is a semantic phenomenon. It is a relation between words and world, between signs and reference, between language and reality. And this relation is not mediated by anything in the head. It is direct. It is external. It is constituted by causal and social factors that lie beyond the reach of introspection, beyond the scope of neuroscience, beyond the explanatory power of any psychological theory. Fodor resisted this. He wanted to preserve a role for internal content, for narrow content, for something in the head that could do explanatory work. And he argued that even if meaning is wide, even if reference is external, there must be something narrow that explains behavior, some internal state that mediates between input and output, some mental representation that the cognitive system manipulates. And he tried to carve out a space for psychology by distinguishing between wide content, which depends on the environment, and narrow content, which does not, which is purely internal, purely psychological, purely computational. But this move was always unstable because narrow content turned out to be elusive, hard to define, hard to individuate, hard to see how it could play the explanatory role Fodor wanted it to play. And many philosophers concluded that narrow content was a myth, that there was no such thing, that all content was wide, that meaning was always externalist, always dependent on factors beyond the head, and if psychology wanted to explain behavior, it would have to appeal to wide content, to states that are individuated by their relations to the environment, to representations that are only representations in virtue of their connections to what they represent. This is deeply counterintuitive, because it means that two people in identical internal states could be thinking different thoughts, could be believing different things, could be referring to different objects, just because they are in different environments, just because their words have different causal histories, just because the world around them is structured differently. And this seems to violate the intuition that mental states are internal, that what you're thinking is determined by what is going on inside your head, that consciousness is private, that the contents of experience are immediately accessible to introspection. But Putnam and Kripke showed that this intuition is wrong, that mental states are not self-intimating, that you can be mistaken about what you're thinking, that the meanings of your thoughts depend on facts about the world that you may not know, that reference is opaque, that you can use words successfully without understanding what they mean, that language works not because speakers have perfect knowledge, but because they are embedded in networks of reference that do the work for them, that connect words to things through mechanisms that operate below the level of consciousness, below the level of intentional control. Burge extended this argument to mental content itself. He argued that not just linguistic meaning, but thought itself is individuated externally, that beliefs and desires are identified by their relations to the environment, that you could not have a belief about water if you lived in a world with no water, that mental content is essentially relational, essentially dependent on what exists outside the mind, and this means that the mind is not a self-contained system, not a module that could be studied in isolation, not a computational device that processes inputs according to internal rules, but an open system, a system that is constituted by its interactions with the world, that is shaped by its environment, that cannot be understood without reference to the physical and social context it is embedded in. This has implications for artificial intelligence, for the question of whether machines can think, because if meaning is external, if reference depends on causal historical connections, if mental content is individuated by relations to the environment, then a computer program, no matter how sophisticated, cannot have genuine thoughts unless it has the right connections to the world, unless it is embedded in the right kind of causal network, unless it participates in the same linguistic and social practices that give human words their meanings. And this suggests that thought is not just computation, not just symbol manipulation, not just syntactic operations on formal structures, but something that requires embodiment, requires situatedness, requires participation in a form of life, and a brain in a vat, no matter how complex its internal processes, would not be thinking about water or trees or anything else, because its words would not be connected to anything, would not refer to anything, would be empty symbols with no semantic content, no meaning, no reference, just syntax running in a void. Putnam himself later came to doubt some of his own arguments. He worried that semantic externalism led to metaphysical realism, to the view that there is a fixed, determinate way the world is, independent of human conceptual schemes, independent of language, independent of theory, and he came to think this was incoherent, that it made reference magical, that it required a God's eye view, a perspective from nowhere that could compare words to things without being situated in any particular framework, and he moved toward internal realism, toward the view that truth and reference are always relative to a conceptual scheme, always dependent on the practices and norms of a community, always constrained by what Quine called the tribunal of experience, but never fully determined by it. And this introduced a tension, a pull between the external world that constrains reference and the internal practices that constitute meaning, a tension that Putnam never fully resolved, that perhaps cannot be resolved, because meaning lives in that tension, in the space between mind and world, between language and reality, between what we intend and what our words actually pick out. Dennett approached this from yet another angle. He argued that meaning is not a real property but a useful fiction, that intentional states are not natural kinds but interpretive stances, that when we attribute beliefs and desires, we are not discovering facts about the mind but adopting a strategy for predicting behaviour. And from this perspective, the question of whether meaning is in the head or in the world dissolves. Because meaning is not anywhere, it is not a real thing but a pattern we impose, a way of organising our understanding of complex systems. And the intentional stance works whether we apply it to humans or thermostats or chess programs. The difference is just pragmatic, just a matter of what level of description is most useful for prediction and explanation. Not a matter of what really has meaning and what does not, because nothing really has meaning. Meaning is always an interpretation, always a projection, always a way of seeing that could be otherwise. But this seems too deflationary, too quick to dismiss the felt reality of meaning, the undeniable sense that words do connect to things, that thoughts are about the world. That reference is not just a useful fiction but a real relation, and even if we cannot fully explain how this relation works, even if semantic externalism leaves gaps and puzzles, it at least takes seriously the intuition that language matters, that what we say makes a difference, that truth is not just coherence within a system but correspondence with reality, however elusive and problematic that correspondence may be. And to give up on this, to reduce meaning to a mere interpretive stance, feels like giving up on something essential, something worth preserving even if we cannot fully explain it, even if it leads to paradoxes and tensions that resist resolution. Because the alternative is a world where nothing means anything, where language floats free of reality, where thought is cut loose from the world, and that is a world too empty, too barren, too divorced from lived experience to be acceptable, even if it is theoretically cleaner, even if it avoids the hard problems, even if it makes philosophy easier by making meaning disappear. Power does not distribute evenly, does not spread across populations in equal measure, does not settle into equilibrium, where everyone has the same, but instead concentrates, accumulates, forms gradients that are steep, that create hierarchies that are natural, not in the sense of being just, but in the sense of being inevitable, being the default pattern that emerges whenever humans organize, whenever groups form, whenever coordination is needed. And the need for coordination is constant, is the condition of social existence, and coordination requires decision-making, requires that someone decides when decisions cannot be made collectively, when consensus is impossible, when speed is necessary, and the necessity creates the opening for power, creates the opportunity for some to decide for others, and the deciding is power, is the core of it, is the ability to shape outcomes, to determine directions, to control resources, and once this ability concentrates, once some have it more than others, the concentration tends to increase, tends to amplify, tends to create the hierarchies that are visible in every society, every organization, every group that persists over time because power reproduces power, is self-reinforcing, is creating the conditions that allow more power to accumulate, and the accumulation is not accidental, is not the result of conspiracy, is the natural geometry of social organization, is the shape that power takes when humans interact over time, and the shape is pyramidal, is hierarchical, is arranging people into levels, into ranks, into positions that vary in their access to resources, to decision-making, to influence, and the variation is not small, is not modest, is extreme, is exponential, is creating gaps between levels that are wider than the gaps within levels. And the widest gap is at the top, is between those who have power and those who do not. And those who have power are few, are the minority, are the elite who sit at the apex of the hierarchy. And the apex is narrow, is limited, is only accommodating a small number, because power shared is power diluted, is power threatened, is power that might be challenged, and so those at the top work to maintain their position, work to prevent others from ascending, work to ensure that the hierarchy remains steep, remains stable, remains resistant to change, and the resistance is not passive, is active, is the exercise of power to preserve power, is the use of resources to maintain access to resources, is the employment of influence to prevent the emergence of rival influences, and the employment is continuous, is strategic, is operating at multiple levels, through multiple mechanisms, through the formal and the informal, through the visible and the invisible, through the structures that are explicit and the processes that are hidden, and the hidden is where power is most effective, is where it operates without being seen, without being named, without being recognized as power, because power that is visible is power that can be challenged, that can be resisted, that can be opposed, but power that is invisible, that operates through assumptions, through norms, through the structures that are taken for granted, is power that is unassailable, is power that reproduces itself without anyone noticing, without anyone objecting, without anyone having the language to describe what is happening. And what is happening is the maintenance of hierarchy through the 1,000 small mechanisms that ensure power stays where it is, that prevent redistribution, that make equality impossible, not just difficult, but structurally impossible, because the system is designed to concentrate power, is organized to funnel resources upward, is arranged to ensure that those at the top remain at the top, and the remaining is not guaranteed by force alone, is not maintained through violence alone, though violence is always available, is always in the background, is the ultimate guarantee of hierarchy. But most of the time force is not needed, is not employed because power has more subtle tools, has mechanisms that operate through consent, through the willing participation of those who are dominated. And the willing is not coerced in the obvious sense, is not forced at gunpoint, is produced through ideology, through the stories that are told about why hierarchy is natural, is necessary, is beneficial. And the beneficial is what those at the top claim, is what they teach, is what they convince others to believe. that hierarchy serves everyone, that power at the top creates order that protects those below, that inequality is the price of stability, of prosperity, of progress, and progress is the mythology that justifies hierarchy, that makes inequality seem temporary, that makes power seem earned, that makes the concentration seem like the result of merit rather than of position. And position is what matters, is what determines outcomes, is what makes some people powerful and others powerless. But the position is inherited, is transmitted, is maintained across generations through the mechanisms that convert power into wealth and wealth into power. And the conversion is seamless, is automatic, is the way that hierarchy perpetuates itself, that ensures that the children of the powerful are powerful, that the descendants of the elite remain elite, that the system reproduces itself. And the reproduction is not perfect, is not total. There is some mobility, some movement between levels, some stories of ascent that serve to legitimate the system, that create the illusion of meritocracy, that make it seem as though anyone can rise, but the rising is rare, is exceptional, is the exception that proves the rule. And the rule is that power stays where it is, that hierarchy is stable, that the geometry is fixed, and the fixing is not natural in the sense of being inevitable by physics, but is natural in the sense of emerging from the logic of organization, from the mathematics of networks, from the dynamics of accumulation, because power is not zero-sum in the short term, can grow, can expand, can create more power, but in the long term, in the context of limited resources, of finite opportunities, of scarce positions, power is rivalrous, is competed for, is gained by some at the expense of others. And the gaining is easier for those who already have power, is easier from positions of advantage, is following the principle that Matthew identified, that to those who have more will be given, and from those who have little, even what they have will be taken, and the taking is not theft, is not crime, is the normal operation of systems that concentrate power, that funnel resources upward, that ensure that advantage compounds, that success breeds success, that power accumulates and the accumulation is exponential, is accelerating, is creating gaps that widen over time, that make the top more distant from the bottom, that make mobility less possible, that make hierarchy more rigid, more entrenched, more resistant to change. And the resistance is structural, is built into the geometry, is not requiring conspiracy, not requiring explicit coordination, is just the natural result of power protecting itself, of those at the top using their position to maintain their position. And the maintenance is not cynical, is not experienced as exploitation, is justified through ideologies that explain why hierarchy is good, why power deserves to be concentrated, why inequality is natural. And natural is the word that does the work, is the justification, is the claim that hierarchy is not created by humans, but is discovered in nature, is visible in animals, in the dominance hierarchies that primates form, that wolves form, that even chickens form, and the forming is instinctive, is biological, is the way that evolution has shaped social species. And if it is natural, then it is not unjust, is not wrong, is simply the way things are, and the way things are is the most powerful justification, is the argument that requires no argument, is the appeal to inevitability, to necessity, to the claim that hierarchy cannot be otherwise. And the cannot is false, is ideological, is the masking of choice as fate, is the presentation of arrangement as nature. Because hierarchies are arrangements, are geometries that are created, that are maintained, that are enforced, and the enforcement is continuous, is requiring effort, is revealing that the naturalness is myth, is story, is the cover for power, for the exercise of domination, for the structuring of society in ways that benefit the top at the expense of the bottom. And the bottom is where most people are, is the base of the pyramid, is the many who support the few, who generate the resources that are concentrated at the apex, who do the work that creates the wealth that flows upward. And the flowing is not natural, but is designed, is structured through laws, through institutions, through the mechanisms that extract value from the many and deliver it to the few. And the delivery is called profit, is called return, is called the reward for capital, for ownership, for the position of controlling resources. And control is power, is the core of it, is the ability to decide how resources are used, who benefits, who is excluded, and the exclusion is the mechanism, is how hierarchy maintains itself, is how power reproduces power, because access is limited, is restricted, is controlled by those who already have access. And access to what? To opportunities, to resources, to the positions that confer power. And the conferring is not automatic, is not open, is requiring credentials, requiring connections, requiring the social capital that comes from position. And position is inherited, is transmitted, is the thing that makes hierarchy stable, that prevents mobility, that ensures that the geometry remains fixed. And the fixed is what those at the top want, is what they work to maintain, is what they defend through the mechanisms that are both overt and covert, that operate through law and through culture, through institutions and through norms, through the structures that are formal and the processes that are informal. And the informal is where much of the work happens, is where power operates most effectively, through networks, through relationships, through the soft power that is harder to see, harder to challenge, harder to dismantle than the hard power of force, of law, of explicit command, because soft power operates through influence, through persuasion, through the shaping of desires and beliefs, through the creation of consent. And consent is what makes hierarchy stable, is what allows domination without constant coercion, is what Gramsci called hegemony, is the condition where the dominated accept their domination, where the powerless believe in the legitimacy of power, where the hierarchy seems natural, seems right, seems like the way things should be. And the should is the achievement, is the conversion of power into authority, of domination into legitimacy, of hierarchy into order. And order is what power promises, is what it delivers, is the stability that comes from everyone knowing their place, accepting their rank, performing their role. And the performing is not resisted, because resistance seems pointless, seems impossible, seems like challenging nature itself. And nature is the mask, is the story, is the ideology that makes power invisible, that makes hierarchy seem inevitable, that makes inequality seem like the necessary cost of civilization. And civilization is the achievement of hierarchy, is the organization of humans into structures that are complex, that are specialized, that are requiring coordination. And coordination is impossible without power, without hierarchy, without someone deciding, someone directing, someone controlling. And the controlling is concentrated, is centralized, is accumulating at the top. And the top is where decisions are made, where resources are allocated, where the direction is set. And the setting is not democratic, is not collective, is not reflecting the will of the many, but is reflecting the interests of the few, of those who have power, of those who sit at the apex. And the apex is maintained through the geometry, through the structure that ensures power flows upward, that resources concentrate, that advantage compounds. And the compounding is what makes hierarchy self-perpetuating, is what makes power stable, is what prevents the redistribution that would create equality. And equality is unstable, is impossible to maintain, is the condition that immediately begins to dissolve once it is achieved. Because humans are not equal in ability, in effort, in ambition. And these differences, even small differences, compound over time, create advantages, create positions, create the beginnings of hierarchy. And once hierarchy begins, it accelerates, it amplifies, it creates the geometry that is inevitable. That is natural. not because it is good, but because it is the pattern that emerges from the mathematics of accumulation, from the logic of networks, from the dynamics of power, and power, seeks to grow, seeks to concentrate, and the concentration is resisted, is challenged, is fought against by those who are excluded, by those who are dominated, by those who suffer under hierarchy. But the resistance is difficult, is requiring coordination, is requiring resources, is requiring power. And power is what the powerless lack, is what they're excluded from, is what makes resistance so difficult, so costly, so often unsuccessful. And the unsuccessful is what history shows, is what the record demonstrates, is the pattern of hierarchies rising and falling, but never disappearing, never being replaced by equality, only being replaced by new hierarchies, by new elites, by new concentrations of power that reproduce the geometry, that maintain the structure, that ensure that power remains concentrated, that hierarchy remains the default, remains the pattern, remains the inevitable outcome of human organization. And the organization is what creates power, is what makes hierarchy necessary, or seems to make it necessary. Because organization requires coordination, and coordination requires decision-making, and decision-making requires power. And power is what some have and others do not. And those who have it work to keep it, work to grow it, work to pass it on. And the passing on is inheritance, is the mechanism of reproduction, is what makes hierarchy stable across time. And the stability is what those at the top value, is what they work to maintain, is what they defend against challenges, against redistribution, against the equality that would threaten their position. And the position is everything, is what determines outcomes, is what makes life easy or hard, is what provides access or denies it, is what confers power or withholds it. And the withholding is structural, is built into the geometry, is the way that hierarchy maintains itself, is the iron law that Michael's identified, is the principle that all organizations, even those founded on egalitarian principles, eventually develop hierarchies, eventually concentrate power, eventually create oligarchies, because organization requires leadership, and leadership becomes power, and power becomes self-perpetuating, becomes the thing that shapes the organization to serve the leaders rather than the members. And the members are the many, are the base, are those who do the work but do not make the decisions, do not control the resources, do not have the power, and the power is what accumulates at the top, is what defines the apex, is what makes hierarchy hierarchical, and the hierarchical is the geometry, is the structure, is the arrangement that is not accidental, is not temporary, is not the result of bad actors or flawed systems, but is the natural pattern, the inevitable outcome, the shape that power takes when humans organize, when groups form, when societies persist. And the persistence is what makes hierarchy visible, is what reveals the geometry, is what shows that power does not distribute evenly, does not create equality, does not settle into balance, but instead concentrates, accumulates, forms the pyramids that are visible everywhere, in every society, in every organization, in every context where humans coordinate. And the coordination requires hierarchy, or seems to require it, and the seeming is enough, is what makes it real, is what makes the geometry inevitable, is what ensures that power will concentrate, that inequality will persist, that hierarchy will remain the default pattern, the natural arrangement, the geometry of power that shapes human life, that determines outcomes, that creates the world where some have much and most have little, where some decide and most obey, where some rule and most are ruled, and the ruling is not eternal, is not permanent. Hierarchies fall, are replaced, are overturned, but they are not eliminated, are not abolished, are not transcended, because the geometry remains, the pattern persists, the structure reasserts itself, and new hierarchies form, new elites emerge, new concentrations of power accumulate at new apexes, and the cycle continues. the pattern repeats, the geometry remains. Because power concentrates, because hierarchy is natural, because equality is unstable, because the geometry of power is not optional, is not chosen, is not the result of conspiracy or design, but is the inevitable outcome, the natural pattern, the way that power arranges itself when humans organize, and the organizing never stops, and the hierarchy never ends, and the geometry persists, always, inevitably, naturally, as the shape of power, as the structure of domination, as the pattern that defines human society, that creates inequality, that maintains hierarchy, that ensures that power remains concentrated, that the few rule the many, that the apex dominates the base, that the geometry of power remains fixed, remains stable, remains the eternal pattern, the natural arrangement, the inevitable structure that is hierarchy, that is power. That is the way things are and have always been and will always be, as long as humans organize, as long as groups form, as long as power exists, and power always exists, always concentrates, always creates the geometry that is hierarchy, that is domination, that is the natural, inevitable, inescapable pattern of human organization. And the organization is power, and power is hierarchy, and hierarchy is geometry, and the geometry is eternal.